If you've ever wondered why trauma doesn't just hurt, but leaves people feeling disconnected from their bodies, from others, and from belonging, this episode is for you. Today on Mastering Change, I'm joined by Lucas Casanova, a transpersonal and Buddhist therapist who works with trauma by helping people reconnect through the body, through felt safety, and through a renewed sense of belonging. Let's meet Lucas. Lucas, it's an absolute pleasure to have you on Mastering Change today. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
If you could let our audience know a little bit more about you, like how you found yourself in the field of trauma, mental health, and well-being.
I think that as most people that work in this arena, the question started with myself and also with my own mental health and well-being. And at one point, I don't know, I was working the kind of corporate life that everyone imagines is the successful life. And my anxiety drop made me rethink my career and started to think, okay, what am I cut for? And I discovered in Buddhism that I was cut for living a much more calmer life. That when people talk about success, I think that for me, success was about belonging, being part of something bigger. Since I am a science person, the roads interconnected with cognitive neuropsychology, and also I started working directly with people, seeing the difference that the Buddhist practices made for me, for my own journey, for my own healing, realizing that that was the missing link in a lot of things that we were doing in another field. So 20 years ago, when I started in the field of trauma, people thought that I was maybe ruining a very good prospect or a very good career because I was sitting people to meditate. And nowadays, I find myself in this interesting place where people are trying to build a bridge between spirituality and science. And for me, it was there all along. So now I work mainly as a Buddhist therapist, transpersonal psychology, cognitive neuroscience, and I work a lot with secular Buddhist practices to create this reconnection with people, spirituality, mind, body.
Okay, so a Buddhist therapist, and so oh, I've got so many questions coming up. But what does a Buddhist therapist mean? You say you work with secular Buddhist practices or traditions,
Yes.
and do they differ from non-secular?
There, we need to do a little bit of history about Buddhism. Buddhism didn't start actually as a religious practice. We can say that Buddha was most probably one of the first trauma therapists that there was, because he was trying to understand the mind and where and how we got stuck and how to unstuck ourselves. The Buddha didn't consider himself religious. But funny thing is that then universities did not exist. And the only way that people can accumulate and systematize knowledge was through non-secular or religious structures. So you can say that the monks and then the nuns in Buddhism became like the hard drive that kept all this knowledge that couldn't be transmitted in any other way. Imagine a time where people needed to memorize things instead of reading them in books. And also, those people were preserved from life because they were keeping this sacred knowledge to go on and on. Buddhism has a particularity that doesn't happen with most other spiritual practices or systems, is that Buddhism transformed itself in every iteration, in every country that Buddhism got transformed by the religious or by the political systems that existed in these different countries. So in the end, what happened is that Buddhism had to become some sort of religiously perceived practice. So this knowledge could be understood and kept through the ages and in different locations around the world. But the birthplace of Buddhism is secular. The Buddha, of course, tried to adapt his knowledge to the people that he spoke to. So most people then found religion as a part of the sense of belonging that human beings we need to have, as a healthy way of seeing ourselves interconnected. And interconnectedness, which is something that Buddhism talks a lot about, is something that Dan Siegel also has been talking a lot about. So the practices in itself can be put into motion with any set of beliefs. Some some might be Buddhist, but some can be in any religion. So the dharmas, as they are called in Buddhism, the practices, can be adapted to almost any setting.
Fascinating. I mean, I love the whirlwind history of Buddhism actually that I didn't really know about, but it makes a lot of sense. And so as you were talking, I was thinking you specifically the use of your words is secular Buddhism.
Yes.
Maybe you did that on purpose because of the wanting to not link Buddhism to the religious. Well,
Yeah.
as I thought, I was thinking of Buddhism, I think it of, as something religious, and you've explained why now. I would think that, and possibly lots of our listeners would think that. When you think of the word spiritual, then, or
Yeah.
spirituality, how does that kind of interlink with Buddhism, secular Buddhism, and religion in as a whole? Then, how do you see that?
I love this question. I love this question. We know we need to go to etymology a little bit. I promise I'm not going to make it boring. But spirituality comes from spiritos, which is the Greek word for it breathes. So spirituality in that sense is every single thing that links every living being.
Okay.
And religion comes from the Latin word religare, which means to reunite, which are the rites and beliefs that reconnect the human with the divine. Some practices can be spiritual and not religious. Some practices can be religious, actually, and not spiritual. So, because you can be connecting yourself with the bigger self, but not necessarily with the sentiment or the feelings of other living beings. Spirituality can be secular and can be religious. To make it short, I had a Zen teacher who was very prosaic. He said he got really angry when he heard this quote from Baba Ram Das that said that humans, we are spiritual beings living a human experience or something of the sorts. And he said that's not actually true, because human beings, we need mind and body. A human that has a body and doesn't have a mind, we call it an undead, a zombie. But on the other side, a mind that doesn't have a body is like a ghost. The problems that we have as humans, spiritual beings, need the body as a part, because we age, we die, we get sick, which are things that Buddhism talks a lot about. And all these things happen only because we have a body. So spirituality needs to include the body to be connecting.
So I want to go back to that etymology piece that you just mentioned. So religion is to reconnect with the divine,
Yes.
and spirituality was to connect to everything. Is that what you said?
Yes, it's the same problems or difficulties or challenges that everything that breathes have. You know, if you breathe, that means that you're going to age, that you're going to get sick, that you're going to die. Those problems are common to every single living being, conscious about that or not.
Okay, and spirituality can be religious because the divine is could be, well, depends what you think of it as the divine. Okay, that's fascinating. It's a really great way of looking at it as well. Okay, thank you very much for that explanation.
You're welcome. I like this idea because it let us make. I don't, for example, when I talk to clients or when I talk even to professionals about spirituality, I don't talk about my beliefs or other people's beliefs. And that is also a way to show how actually you can bring in Buddhism or secular Buddhism as a part of the way you understand your own mind and also potentiate your own beliefs.
So now we've touched on religion, we've touched on spirituality. Now it's the neuroscience. You mentioned earlier before we actually started this conversation, you mentioned that you are a scientist at heart and cognitive neuroscientist. What does that mean? And how does the scientific mind conflict with this idea of spirituality that you have?
That started for me. I was raised Catholic, and at one point I got into yoga and meditation before I went into Buddhism. So I actually went. I grew up in a country with. I grew up in Argentina, even though I live in Norway now. And in that country, you have a very big Jewish population. I grew up Catholic. Then I don't know, I flirted with Hinduism to call it somehow, yeah, somehow like trying to discover a little bit what was it. And then I went into Buddhism. When I was going through this process, I realized I was already man of science. So when people were telling me about the chakras and the wheels of energy and so on, immediately in my mind, I thought about the vagus nerve and about the innervation of the front of the body and how the chakras are actually a model for embodiment, that they show what it is to be present in these different parts of the body. So it's actually spirituality and religion took language from culture in general, but also discovered these metaphors of what it is to be alive and understand your own mind. So, in time, can you repeat me the question? Because I think I am missing a part of it.
So, you're as a scientist, how I think of science, and
Yes.
often how I think of how scientists think, the idea of spirituality is so, until very recently, the idea of spirituality has really been kind of shunned by the scientist community. It's been kind of only very small, not there's been very small studies done around spirituality and what that can look like and whether and that, but that in the recent maybe 5 years has kind of increased and people have become more brave about talking about
Yeah.
spirituality in the scientific community.
Yes.
And I wondered how your kind of science brain dealt with the conflict between this idea of spirituality and science and how you found a meeting point.
I think that the meeting point for all this is understanding that human knowledge is developed in metaphors a lot of times, and that also the human culture has been evolving from magical thinking into critical thinking. So, in the end, what the ancient populations said about embodiment, the connection between mind and body, this perspective of the chakras, for example, that talk about the throat, the heart, the gut, that were the original so-called energy centers. It was actually a phenomenological way of understanding how it is to be present, to be ventral vagal there, and what happens if we shut down in this place. I was so keen on understanding why these cultures created these metaphors that when I went to talk to doctors in anthropology and philosophy and so on, they said, you need to imagine that all that you know about the brain now did not exist then, that they couldn't understand what was the difference between the movement of your hand and the feelings in the palm of your hand when you touch your own heart or when you give a hug. So these feelings, this interoception, this proprioception was not even understood until very recently. So a lot of these were metaphors. And I always thought, as a man of science who got a lot of benefit from spiritual practices, that we didn't know the link yet, that the link needed to be there somehow. Because I don't think that the Dalai Lama has been talking a lot about this. I don't think that the science needs to be so stern not to include these human needs. And also, these human needs need to be somehow included into the science. So, this, when I started my journey as a therapist, all these things were not understood, and I had to meditate at home and work in with a cognitive approach on the session. But I realized that I elaborated this concept of spiritual safety, that if people do not feel this sense of connection with someone that they are working with, if they don't feel the sense of belonging, then this possibility of sharing this knowledge or participating in a more complex cognitive experience is out of question.
Fascinating. And that sense of belonging that you talk about with someone that they're working with, that you mentioned sort of spiritual safety, or is that something that is just innately there then with your clients, or is it something that you can't necessarily cultivate it with everyone? It'll be a case of it is an intuitive sense, felt sense when you sit in front of someone or with someone on Zoom.
That is a very difficult question to answer because in science, when we talk about innate, we don't know much about the innate capabilities of someone to reframe their spirituality or not. What we know as a fact is that people that survived trauma of any kind, including religious trauma, we all have a clear sense or need of belonging. And these people feel isolated and disconnected. So spiritual safety or integration of sense of belonging in Buddhism even is seen as one of the three main events that every human being goes through. We are all born, we all die, and we all want to belong. The protection of the herd in the sense of agency in co-regulating with others, in also sharing knowledge, in having some sense of transcendence. The transcendence is nothing else but the legacy that we want to leave behind for other people to take. So the sense of belonging is, or the need of belonging is always there. The problem is that to be able to unlock that sense of isolation, we know as a fact that it cannot be cognitively and that we need to include the body into it. So spiritual practices, especially for people that come from very religious backgrounds, when you start to develop the sense of spiritual safety and practices that are secular, help them understand in their own code or language the sense of belonging that they had been ostracized from, for example. So, of course, there are cases that, and this Bessel van der Kolk said it more than one time in his last participation in Oxford, that when you treat complex trauma, it's not just one technique that works. You need to work with a more circular approach, more integrative. So I am cautious when I say that, okay, this works in every case because it's an innate need of connection. It doesn't work that way. But in complementation with the mind body techniques, spirituality, and also explaining how our brain works in connection with our behavior, with our sense of purpose, with our sense of participation in social life or in nature, that gives us an edge that makes a lot of people, especially in the most vulnerable communities, feel that we speak a language that they can understand.
Okay, so that's what I was wondering. Is it's like you're almost, because often I think this sense of belonging when you are with a therapist is sort of, it's almost like for example, on the most basic level, if I'm a native Chinese speaker and my therapist is a native English speaker, I might not ever feel that connection, that bonded connection that you get
Mhm.
from potentially someone who speaks my language, understands my culture. But what you've just said is actually this idea of spiritual safety kind of removes that kind of, just adds a different language. It's a new language, a language that both people can speak that's separate to their language of their native mother tongue or where they come from or anything like that.
I think that that came from the training of working with vulnerable populations. Since I had been working more than 1 decade as a trauma therapist in Europe with refugees and migrants coming from different zones of the world. Migration has tides depending on the conflicts that we see in different countries. So your possibility to adapt to different culture profiles is it becomes limited at the end. You need to find a common language and you need to find a simple language that you can use to cross those barriers that are expressed in cultural, gender, and also linguistic differences. So it becomes more primal, not primitive, but more primal in the sense that it recognizes easier what it is that are the main drivers of humanity, this sense of belonging, this sense of interconnectedness, this sense of interdependence that are very Buddhist terms. But and that neuroscience has been explaining also from the brain perspective in the work of, as I quoted before, Dan Siegel or even Rick Hanson, this idea of keeping it simple and small to keep it also possible and digestible, especially when you work with heavily traumatized people that need to know a way that safety is something that is possible, regardless if they experienced that in the past and they lost it, or they have now the possibility to experience it for the first time.
So talk to me a little bit more about the work that you've been doing then in Europe. If you say you've been working with refugees and
Yes.
for the last decade, tell me a
Yes.
little bit about that. How did that come about, and what is it that you've been doing?
Mainly, I work in nonprofit organizations with people that do not have the right yet or the possibility to have trauma therapy, people that arrive from war zones or persecuted politically or gender issues. So when they arrive here, when I say here, I mean Norway. When they arrive here, they are expected to be able to cope with a system that thinks that everyone has the same rights. which sounds ideal. But on the other side, imagine that someone that had been living in a pyramidal system, that maybe they felt at the bottom or even out of it, they are asked to belong to a circle where everyone is seeing you and also you're being part of something bigger. A lot of people do not know how to relate to that because it's the first experience that they have with this. And so creating like this bridge on one side and firewall on the other to soften the blows of what it is to come, for example, from Afghanistan or Syria or, I don't know, Rwanda, and come to Scandinavia, and what it is to be part of a society that sees things in such a different way. Also, when you are a subject of violence for whatever the reason, you arrive here in this defensive state. And some people do not see themselves as, of course, violent people, but they see themselves having anger that they cannot guide or resolve. And that anger, a lot of times, can be softened with proper regulation. And regulation sometimes does not start in understanding and does not start, maybe it's too early for EMDR. It needs to start in more in somatic work and less in talking and more in observing and moving and recognizing how the body is aligned and oriented in this new place that you are now, and how this place can welcome you and how can you connect with nature, with people. And then, of course, as a beautiful consequence, then people do not miss their appointments with doctors and police and so on, so they can participate in the reception process, in the asylum seeking in another way, and also creating a community, because we live very isolated now, and phones are marvelous to connect with people that are far away, but they're very, very bad to connect with people that are very close by. So to create that sense of, I don't know, cooking together or sharing a space together or watching a film, and starting to discover how the body feels when you are present in that way. For some people, the loss of interoception or the perception of their own bodies is a safety mechanism. So is it safe enough to feel again? How can we make it safe enough so you can open to the joy of life once more?
And you do this, you help people feel that safe enough to feel something again. Is it, you sort of mentioned somatic practices, but we also haven't talked about the specific kind of secular Buddhist practices that you said helped you in the early days that you now bring into your work today. So
Yes.
do you want to talk a bit about those?
Yes, I developed a system that uses 5 meditation techniques that come from different lines of Buddhism, adapted to a secular point of view. And I can mention them, but they are like Shamat, Vipassana, Anapanasati, Met, and Tonglen. Usually we start with Anapanasati, like very small and connected to the breath and different variations, and then slowly move into other things. Some people cannot start with the breath, so they need to start with movement. Controlling the breath, especially with suspension and so on, can be seen as something very dangerous for many abused individuals. So we start with the reconnection with the space. There are a lot of things that can sound a lot like mindfulness, I guess. Some can connect also a little bit with this idea of the centers or the spaces of the body and the connection and the touch, like a neuroaffective touch. And this slowly goes from bottom up, like the experience of being in a place, what you see when you are sitting with other people, what happens when you have someone in front of you, what happens with the breath when you feel calm, and start to develop small things that pile up one after the other that show your default mode network, that the stories that you tell yourself about yourself can have a rest, that you don't need to take everything that you feel or think about yourself so seriously, that you start to have like glimpses, or as we call them, glimmers of experiences that maybe they are very special and that they only happen in therapy or they only happen in this space that you are creating with this new community. So it looks a lot like church for some people, because the sense of safety that they had when they went to the mosque or when they went to the church before everything happened, is a new way of reconnecting with your beliefs, which is when we talk about faith, I like thinking about the things that you believe about things you cannot have evidence of. You have a strong belief that something is going to happen in a certain way, but you cannot really prove it. And all your driver, your body, your mind, your breath, your thoughts are all going towards seeing that happening. Is in your heart. In Buddhism and in Hinduism, it's called sankalpa. When you have this powerful idea and all in yourself is aligned towards that. Trauma makes you lose your faith, and trauma makes you feel disconnected. So even if your faith starts knowing or reawakening on how it is to start a new day, how it is to be in contact with someone that cares for you. So starts like very, very small, but I feel and I saw in our practice that IFS, EMDR, and so on are much easier when it exists this sense of safety and connection.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I mean, you mentioned this idea of regulation earlier. I mean, you need to be in that state, that regulated state, in order to be able to kind of enter any kind of cognitive processing, whether it's
Exactly.
ER or IFS or anything. And I think, as you said, the first sense of safety that we lose when we go through trauma often, in fact, I think probably almost all the time, is our sense of safety in our bodies, like how safe
Mm.
we feel in, because when we think about home or a sense of belonging, that's the first home is our body, right? That's the first
Mhm.
place that we belong somewhere, is when we, as soon as we're babies, we kind of suddenly, when very, very young, we don't even know that we are connected to our bodies. It's kind of it's the mother that we're connected to. We are her body. That's the only kind of body we understand. And then as we start to understand more about our own selves and feelings and stuff, we sort of reside in, we have a body. And once we know that, then I think trauma is that's what it disconnects us from, that sense of belonging to ourselves, first of all, and connection from ourselves. So it's understandable. It makes sense that the first thing you need to do is connect people back to themselves and their body and make them feel, like you say.
Imagine that in this segment of the population that I work with, that also extrapolates with any other segment, because I work as a private therapist and I work with other populations. But the sense of not being safe to reconnect with your biological family, for example, and how important it is for you to be connected to life, to be able to get everything that life has to offer you. Is one thing that we work a lot, for example, is the relationship between trauma and your beliefs around money. It's very hard for people that feel in danger to feel that they have agency towards money. So, and we talk a lot about how is this, and we show them how is this connection to life. How is this? How can you make yourself feel safe? Some people have great jobs. They earn a lot of money. They don't feel safe. They cannot save money. It is very complicated for them to have some sort of stability there. So it needs to change in this inner perception that you are part of life. There is a French author, I'm sorry, I cannot remember the name. He made the difference between the biological and the logical family. The biological is the one that brings us into the world, but the logical one is that the one that we create and that we feel that we belong to. And spiritual safety is that is you belong to the bigger family. Maybe these people did not take care of you the way they should, or maybe your country, or maybe your partner, or whomever did not take care of you in the way that they should have done. But now you have the possibility to recognize the rest of the connection with life and how you are sustained by life.
Fascinating, honestly, Lucas. I could talk about this with you all day long, to be totally honest. But if I'm gonna leave it there, I think. And I would like to just thank you so much for coming onto the podcast. I really appreciate your time. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.